Well, welcome everybody. It's noon, so we will get started. As a few housekeeping items, if you would mind, for the first half an hour or so, muting yourself and maybe shutting off your video. That would be great, just because sometimes video and a lot of faces on screens can be really distracting. So for the first 30 minutes or so, and I'll be admitting people as we go along here. And I'm also recording this. So if you miss any portion of it and if you have to sign off and you want to come back to it at any time, just send me an email and I will send you the recording. So let's see. Well, we have a pretty good set of folks here. So it looks like, and we're at the 12 o'clock hour. So we will get started. The first thing that I'm going to do is in the chat, just like any good class session, there's always a handout. And so in the chat is a handout, and I will periodically be posting that in the chat so that people can, if they're coming in late, they can receive it. This handout has some maps that we'll look at the beginning, and then it's also a useful place to write down any notes. So these sessions count as diversity credit, and if you're a faculty member hoping that for this to go toward professional development, this is a good way to think about how might you use this information in your classroom to enhance inclusivity. So here is that document again. So I'll just add it one more time. Okay. So if you don't know me, my name is Dr. Courtney Brentz, and I am a new Associate Dean in Arts and Sciences. And I am joined today by Dr. Dan Clanton, who is an Associate Professor at Doane University. His background is in biblical studies, and he researches a lot on the relationship between Bible and pop culture. And he is also a practitioner of Judaism. So we get this excellent kind of dual perspective of being a scholar of Bible, but then also a practitioner of Judaism as well. So welcome to Dan. Hello. And if you're just joining us, if you wouldn't mind muting yourself and putting your video off for now, that would be great. And then after about 30 minutes, when we open up to Q&A, then that will be a time to really build community. So welcome, Dan. Thanks for joining us at SEC.
No, thank you for having me.
So if you are just joining, there is a handout that's shared in the chat, and I'll share it again now. And I want to look at that to start because one thing that's always important when we talk about religion, and my background is in religious studies. So specifically my area is Chinese Buddhism. And it's really important whenever we are talking to somebody who is a practitioner to not assume that they speak for like the entirety of Jews or the entirety of Buddhists. So I provided a map here of the various Jewish communities that we have in Southeast Nebraska so that you can see the diversity of traditions. And so I'll stop sharing my screen so that's not too much for you all, but I wanted you to see that in that handout. And have the first question, Dan, to you be, can you talk a little bit about differences in Jewish communities? So here we have Reform, we have Orthodox, we have Conservative. What are we talking about when we're talking about differences?
Well, it's a great question. And I am assuming that given our demographic in Nebraska, that most of the folks that are joining us today identify in some way as Christian. I mean, I'm rolling the statistical dice here. And we should understand differences among Jews as being kind of analogous to different denominations or different sects of Christianity. But another way we can think about the diversity in Judaism is to think about, I'm going to share my screen for just a sec, is to think about a model of trajectories. So if we think about the development of Judaism as occurring in different places at different times, amidst different cultures, then we can imagine that we've got a kind of originating event here. And listen, my friends, I'm just going to apologize. I am not an artist, so what you're going to see are just some scratches. We can imagine a model that looks like this, okay? As we go through time, and this originating event, we could say is, just for the sake of argument, the revelation of Torah at Sinai. So once we get a foundational text in Judaism that serves as a kind of core or basis for identity and practice, what we find are different Jewish communities at different times in different places reacting and responding differently to that core text as they try and make their way in different cultures. So what I mean by that is we have Jews at different times in different places who are asking, how can we continue to be Jews and find meaning in our central sacred text in the culture in which we find ourselves? And Jews historically have always been a minority culture within a larger umbrella culture. And anytime you have a minority culture under a larger majority umbrella culture, there are a couple of options that that minority culture has. They can resist that umbrella majority culture. They can withdraw into themselves and be not xenophobic, but kind of secluded. They can simply give up their identity and assimilate into that broader culture, or they can take a medial ground and acculturate to that broader culture, still retaining some of their identity, but also adopting some of the identity, some of the ideas, and some of the practices of the larger culture. So if we map that on to the different kinds of Judaism that we have in our corner of Nebraska that Dr. Bruntz showed you all, we can see that we've got a Hasidic and an Orthodox, a couple of Hasidic and a couple of Orthodox communities. Those folks would be more on the resisting side. Those folks would be more along that spectrum of saying, we're really going to try and preserve our traditions and not adopt too many of the cultural practices and beliefs of this larger culture. At the other end of that spectrum, you would find groups like Reform Jews, who are more progressive, who are more liberal in their approach to their Jewish identity, and much more willing historically to adopt and adapt to the majority cultures in which they find themselves. And in between those, we've got a medial position that's characterized by conservative Jewish communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what I'm really hearing from you is, unlike Christianity, that's very much orthodoxy, which means, in religious studies terms, this means right belief. And for those of you just joining, welcome. I'm joined today by my friend, Dr. Dan Clanton. But what I'm hearing from you is really this orthopraxic, that it's about practicing and living out one's tradition.
Right, absolutely. And a good shorthand way for us to remember that is that in Judaism, it's really deed, not creed. So again, for those of you who identify as Christian or who are probably more familiar with Christianity, Christianity is one of the great creedal traditions on our planet. That is, to be a Christian means in large part that you agree to a set of propositions that are theological and intellectual in nature. Judaism really doesn't have a creed. Instead, you are a Jew by your actions. So the technical term that we use to describe an observant Jew is a shomer mitzvot. That is someone who observes the mitzvot, the commandments that we find in Torah.
Mm-hmm. Can you give an example of how particular Jewish communities might interpret a deed differently in order to live Judaism properly according to their understanding.
Oh yeah. And listen, as we're talking about this, please remember that every Jewish community throughout history is having to deal with a very simple proposition. That is, things change, and sometimes they change radically. And so Jewish communities, just like all other religious communities, have to ask ourselves constantly, how is it possible for us to understand ourselves as Jews in this time, in the time in which we find ourselves? And in Judaism, there's actually a fairly remarkable openness to interpreting texts and interpreting Torah, especially, in very different ways. So one of my favorite examples of this is the central ritual observance in Judaism, which is observing the Sabbath or Shabbos. And this is something that is deeply ingrained in our Jewish identity. This observance of Sabbath. The Hebrew word that we get that English word Sabbath from, Shabbat, literally means to cease or to stop. And we hear this as early as Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. God ceases creating. God Sabbaths creating. And then we also hear in places like Exodus and Deuteronomy that we're supposed to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. Okay, this is something that all branches of Judaism agree is a fundamentally important part of being Jew, is this keeping of Sabbath. Okay, but when we talk about remembering and keeping holy, what does that mean? What does it mean to keep the Sabbath holy? How does one do that? And how does one interpret the literal meaning of the word Shabbat as stop or cease? As you might imagine, we've had different responses to this in different times and in different locations, but generally speaking, by the time we get to around 200 to 600 in the Common Era, or AD, what we're dealing with is a compilation of Jewish literature that tries to codify a ton of different responses and interpretations of Torah. And generally speaking, we call this the Talmud. And the Talmud is an encyclopedia of Jewish learning. And it is a collection of all the different attempts that these different Jewish communities have made to answer our fundamental question. How do we understand ourselves as Jews in this time? Well, when it comes to observing Sabbath, what we find in the Talmud is that there are a number of restrictions built up around this idea of Sabbath to help Jews cease and remember and observe. So what we eventually have is a whole collection. I know this is going to sound a little odd to some of you, but we have a whole collection of different kinds of work that rabbinic authorities, rabbis, authorized scriptural interpreters, and community leaders, all these different kinds of work that rabbis say, this is what you should stop doing for Sabbath. And just to give you all an idea of what that looks like, I'm sharing my screen with you, and here is a list of the 39 melachot, the different prohibited activities. So you can see sowing, plowing, reaping, gathering, threshing, winnowing. And guys, obviously some of these make more sense in our agricultural context in Nebraska than they would in other geographical locales. But let me point you to one specific one. Number 37, ma'avir, kindling or making a fire. Okay, now you may be thinking, okay, that's no big deal. if I want to be a good observant Jew, then I just won't start a fire on Shabbos. Okay, but Jews need light just like everybody else. And maybe we also want to eat on Sabbath. So how do we think about doing those things if we want to really take this commandment seriously? And we could even push this further. What if somebody needs to go to the hospital? What is it that you utilize when you start your car? When you turn the key, you are engaging a spark plug. You are literally kindling your car. So again, if we take a very conservative view of what it means to stop work on Sabbath, then we try to refrain from starting a car. Now, I should mention two things. One, there is a blanket admonition in Jewish literature and Jewish ethical thought that any of these commandments can be thrown out the window if it's in service of saving a life. So even if you are in the most orthodox, conservative, strictly observant neighborhood in Jerusalem on Shabbos, and somebody has to go to the hospital, someone will start a car and drive them to a hospital. The second thing is, guys, it's not the Middle Ages anymore. It's 2021. We have technology. So some Jews, if they want to be observant, but also like to have lights, some Jews will buy an automatic light switch. And if you think that some Jews who are strictly observant about starting cars on Sabbath are not kind of excited about self-driving cars, then you need to rethink this. So all of this is bound up in what it means to be a Jew, what it means to regard our sacred texts and the commandments that are in those texts, because the observance of those, the rituals that they instruct us to perform, all of those serve as a way to refocus ourselves, to imbue the secular and the ordinary with a sense of the sacred, to constantly remind ourselves of who we are and with whom we are in relationship.
So if you are joining us late and are kind of picking us up in the conversation, I'm joined today by Dr. Dan Clanton, who background is biblical studies, but is also a practitioner of Judaism. And really what we've set the foundation for is that Judaism is a very diverse tradition with various denominations within it, similar to other religious communities. And really it comes down to how is one observing the right way of living. Dan, is there a particular tradition that you most closely identify with?
Yes, I converted actually into the Reform tradition. So we lived in Denver for 15 years, and while we were there, I underwent the process of conversion and became part of and taught in a Reform community out there. And as I said earlier, that Reform community means that we are a little more progressive. We're a little more willing to look at our history and look at some of the commandments as being context bound, as being historically rooted. And so we're a little more willing than other branches of Judaism to say, yes, we know that's there. Yes, we value that, but it's not exactly applicable to that, again, our central question: how do we understand ourselves as Jews in this time?
Mm-hmm. So Reform synagogues will have cars in the parking lot.
Yes, Reform synagogues will have cars. If any of you live close to an Orthodox or even sometimes a conservative synagogue or temple, sometimes they'll be referred to in Yiddish as a shul or a school. You will often see folks walking to those temples on Shabbos.
Great. So this lays a perfect foundation for getting into our topic today, which is about the intersections of health, wellness, and spirituality. And I appreciate you starting us out by really encapsulating the diversity of traditions, because as I said at the start, as one who's coming from religious studies, it's always important that we recognize diversity within religious traditions and that no practitioner stands for the entirety of a tradition. Right. So now kind of speaking from your perspective, especially as a Reformed Jew, help us make sense of kosher, of kashrut. And if you're joining us, there's a handout, I'll send it one more time through the chat, that has these terms and terminologies. So talk us through, what is kosher, what is kashrut, what are we talking about here?
Yeah, so kashrut is a word that we use to refer to a whole complex of dietary regulations and restrictions that are present in a kind of kernel form in Torah, in our most central sacred text. But again, these have been augmented and these have been expanded and elaborated on as we move throughout the centuries. So when we use kashrut, we're referring both to this complex of laws and to a dietary practice. So that's kind of the nominative or noun form. When we use the term kosher, it's more of an adjective. So kosher meat or kosher wine. Both of these come from the Hebrew word kasher, which means something like proper or fit. So kashrut as a word literally means something like what is appropriate or what is fit. And the basic justification for kashrut as a system of dietary regulation is, like I said, already present in Torah. If we go back to Genesis and we look in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29, it seems that God there, after creating the first human, is designating certain things as acceptably edible, and which implies that the other things that are around that you could eat are not acceptable or not as acceptable. And the interesting thing about this is that I know Dr. Brunts will enjoy, and some of you might enjoy as well, is in chapter 1, verse 29, the things that God says are appropriate to eat, guys, it's a vegan diet.
I'm vegan.
Yes. Oh, did I out you as vegan in front of everyone?
You just outed me as vegan.
Oh, no,
but that's okay.
I'm so sorry. So we get this in chapter 1. It's not until chapter 9, after the flood, that God finally says, you know what, it's fine. You can eat these animals. And this is great for us for a couple of reasons. First is, guys, now we can make brisket. But secondly, it also pushes us to, or it also mentions one of the fundamental requirements of kashrut, and that is the requirement that meat has no blood in it. So if meat is going to be considered kosher, Genesis, or acceptable or fit to eat, Genesis says it can't have blood in it. And later on in Leviticus chapter 7, we hear that humans aren't supposed to eat the fat of animals. So again, if meat is going to be fit or appropriate, it can't have blood in it, can't have fat in it. And still in Torah, when we come to Deuteronomy, we start to hear about regulations about how animals are to be slaughtered. And this is, again, the idea of shechita, or the laws of ritual slaughter, which necessitate a specialized religious officiant called a shochet, or a butcher, who is schooled in these laws of kashrut. So already still in Torah, we've got some fairly significant limitations here. Mm-hmm. But let me tell you one that I know personally a lot of folks have a lot of trouble with, and that is the regulation in kashrut that we hear in Exodus chapters 23 and 34 and in Deuteronomy 14, that, and I apologize, I know this is going to sound weird, that you're not supposed to boil a kid in its mother's milk. I know that sounds a little odd to us, but again, as that regulation travels through time in different communities and different places, again, ask, how do we understand that in our time as it relates to how we understand ourselves as Jews? What that's come to mean is that you're not supposed to mix meat and dairy. So I hate to burst anyone's bubble, but you cannot get a cheeseburger in Israel. I know this may be off-putting to some of you, but this is just part of these dietary restrictions. And that idea of not mixing meat and milk, that also pushes us to understand a couple of other points. First of all, this idea of not mixing things, that is very deeply ingrained in the priestly worldview that underlies a lot of the regulations that we find in Torah. So it's not just meat and milk. We hear about certain kinds of fabrics that aren't supposed to mix, certain kinds of people that aren't supposed to mix, because priests are very, very interested in borders and boundaries and separating things. Secondly, Jews have long made a distinction between two kinds of commandments. One kind is called mishpatim mitzvot, or ethical commandments. And most of these are very easy to understand because in Torah, we're given a rationale for them. It's don't do this, and here's why you shouldn't do it. But we also have some commandments that we call hukim mitzvot, or absolute commandments. And these are just things that we're told, do this or don't do this, and there's no explanation. Almost all of the rules about food fall into this category, which makes them both really hard to understand and really open to interpretation later on. Mm-hmm. And this distinction, guys, is really important because there are some Jewish communities, like I said, who are much more willing to say, yeah, we don't know exactly why we're supposed to do that, but we're still going to do it. And then you find more progressive, more liberal forms of Judaism, like Reform Judaism, that says, yeah, we're not sure why we're supposed to do that. It probably meant something at that point in history. It's not as important for us as we understand our Jewish identity right now, so we're not going to worry about that as much. Mm-hmm. So that means that in my house, I can have a cheeseburger. That's the bottom line there.
Mm-hmm. So dietary restrictions, so kosher as an adjective is referring to this word of permissible. So that could be beyond food, then I'm assuming as well.
Right.
Okay. So then kashrut is referring to these dietary restrictions and laws that have their foundation within scripture, but then have been interpreted throughout time by rabbis and Jewish leaders. And then that's identifying and distinguishing how does one properly be Jewish in that given time period, correct?
Right.
So what are some of the other restrictions, about pigs and shellfish? I had a question by a professor who couldn't make it today that asked, that they grew up Jewish and they always heard that these animals are considered unclean and impure and not good for your health. So what are some of the other examples and what's this correlation with health?
Well, I've heard that too. Right, that shrimp are not healthy, which I grew up in Arkansas, and as a Southerner, that is deeply troubling to me. But also, growing up in Arkansas, I have a lot of trouble with the pig being dirty. Our mascot in Arkansas is the Razorback pig, so that's a little unsettling. But here's the thing: when we talk about the issue of health and kashrut or a kosher diet, yes, there is some scientific evidence now that a kosher diet is in some ways a little healthier than other diets. but we always have to remember that the societies and the cultures that first came up with these laws, that these are pre-scientific societies. And so we can't really assume any sort of medical or gastrointestinal knowledge on their part. But it is an interesting, it's an interesting question to ask, especially now, since many forms of Judaism are growing more and more concerned and active in movements to affect sustainability and to combat climate change. So we have a whole movement that some folks have actually dubbed eco-kosher practices. So we have more and more Jews that are adopting vegetarian or vegan lifestyles. One of my close Jewish friends, her husband just opened a kosher vegan butcher shop in there where they live in New York. And this grows out of these health concerns, but also concerns about what are the environmental impacts of the kinds of practices that we've been engaging in terms of ritual slaughter, in terms of consumption. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that's going on right now, thanks to technological advances.
Mm-hmm. So again, it's that question of what is the right practice? So in this moment in time, in order to have a proper relationship with humans and animals and God, how should one properly move within society?
Absolutely.
Interesting. That's really interesting. So the vegan diet is always the safe bet if you are hosting someone.
If you're worried about it, yes, the vegan will get you over that hump.
Okay, but then also always ask about gluten and nuts too.
Absolutely, right.
As beyond Judaism, yes. So at this point, I do want to open it up to questions and conversation. So for audience members, you can either use the chat or feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and show your video. I have more questions I can pepper Dan with, but I want to open this up for conversation. So if anybody has a question, please feel free to ask it.
And you can ask it in English. You don't have to do it in Hebrew.
If there aren't any questions, I'll keep
I actually have a question.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so going back to the conversation where you said saving a life sort of helps you to circumvent certain things or can be used to bypass some of these rules. What level do you take that to? How do different levels or orthodoxies, conservative versus liberal Judaism, do they have different levels to which they take that or can constrain that rule?
That's a great question. And let me back a step up from that and say, when we're talking about all of these commandments, we do have a tendency to refer to them as laws or rules or even commandments, but it's probably better to think of them as mitzvot, as righteous actions. So if we think of them that way, then we avoid the possibility of viewing Judaism as kind of rule-based or anxious about making sure we don't step over any lines or anything like that. And if we look at them as righteous actions, it also helps us to understand your question a little bit better, because let's say, hypothetically, I, as a Reform Jew, think that it's okay to not perform or ignore a righteous action in order to save somebody. Well, there's nobody looking over my shoulder. There's no pope that we have to appeal to. There's no centralized leadership in Judaism. There is a conception in Judaism of sin, but there is no kind of codified law. There's no kind of codified hierarchy that I have to prostrate myself in front of or anything like that. So all that is to say that it's a fairly an individual decision. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
So I have a question. This is just a small one, but
Sure.
I was ignorant of a prohibition about eating the fat with the meat. So I'm just having dealt with cuts of meat and everything. So kosher meat, does that mean it's just closely trimmed, or does that mean like if there's marbling, do we avoid those cuts? No hamburger.
I don't pretend to understand the intricacies of what it takes to correctly ritually slaughter an animal and then prepare different cuts. My experience with kosher meat has been pretty much restricted to eating it when I visited Israel and ordering it once or twice in a restaurant. So even though I am Jewish, my wife didn't convert. Our kids participated in Jewish ritual in the house as much as they wanted to. So we don't keep kosher in my house. Some of you may recognize the wisdom in this. I don't come between my wife and the meat that she chooses to eat. That would be a bad proposition all the way around. But again, as we're talking about what are the correct ways to live out that particular righteous action, in the mindset of, as I am performing this righteous action, it serves as a ritual way for me to focus my energies on these relationships that I'm fostering on a horizontal and a vertical level. Horizontal level with my Jewish community as it exists now and throughout time, and on a vertical level with God. So I would trust my shochet. I would trust my kosher butcher to take care of all of that stuff for me.
What's interesting too is if folks who are joining us are able to join us in a couple of weeks when we talk about Islam, there's a lot of similarities with kosher and halal. So coming down to no pork, but then also how the animal is slaughtered. So Dan, can you talk a little bit more about that too? Because this is also important in Islam, is that if animals are going to be slaughtered, that it's done in a way to cause less pain. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yep, it's the same in Judaism. The idea is that in a kosher slaughterhouse, which has to be inspected, that all kosher slaughterhouses have to carry a certain rabbinic stamp of approval. So rabbis have to go and inspect the conditions. There's a certain level of cleanliness. There's a certain level of professionalism, and the idea, and all of that revolves around the idea that the animal is not made to suffer, that the slaughtering happens in a way that the animal experiences minimal pain, that the act of killing is done in a ritual way, again, to carry out this idea of I'm performing this action as a righteous act, as in accordance with my text and my tradition. And then the meat is prepared and stored in a certain way also. So yeah, as you said, there are some very interesting overlaps between Judaism and Islam in that sense. And that'll be fun to hear.
Mm-hmm. Well, that kind of gives me a sense that when we're talking about health and wellness, what does it mean to be a spiritual self? That health and wellness extends beyond humans, that it's extending into animals, and health and wellness as well, health and wellness for the environment. And that it's really, really seen as humans as part of this larger ecosystem, and not just separate from animals in that sense.
Absolutely. We try to pay close attention and emphasize the fact that in Torah, in Genesis, even before God enters into a covenantal relationship with Abraham, who Jews, Christians, and Muslims all see as a central originating figure in their tradition. Even before God cuts a covenant with Abraham in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. Right after the flood, in Genesis 9, God establishes a covenant with all of creation, with the earth, with animals, with humans, and promises, I'm never going to destroy you again. So even before humans are singled out for a covenantal relationship in Genesis 12, 15, and 17, there's a pre-existing covenant already with the entirety of creation. And so that serves as an important resource for us as we think through these questions of how is it that we relate, again, on that horizontal level to our Jewish community and beyond.
And very this worldly as well, right? Not in the sense of emphasizing life to come, but this life.
Absolutely.
Any other questions from folks that are joining us? I always have more questions in my pocket for to ask, but want to make sure that anyone is able to ask any questions they have.
I'll tell you all what I tell my students. Real live Jew, no waiting.
A question from Dr. Barone is, can you explain the significance of the burnt offering?
Sure. So we're talking about the burnt offering that's made in the context of animal sacrifice in the temple in Jerusalem? Yes. Okay. Well, I just want to make sure. So in the history of Judaism, there have been two temples that have stood in Jerusalem. The first temple was built around the 10th century BCE, was destroyed in the early 6th century BCE. The second temple was built in around 515 BCE and was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. So we've had two temples. In both of them, we think, even though we have much better sources about the second temple, but in both of them, we think that the process of worship is the same. And this burnt offering that you mentioned in the chat, this is central. So the idea of animal sacrifice was the primary mode of worship when the temple is standing. And you can sort of imagine yourself, put yourself in the position of a religious pilgrim that has been told, has heard that the only place that earth and heaven meet is in Jerusalem at the temple. It's the one place where God's glory is made manifest. So you make the journey, the ritual journey to the temple. You enter an outer courtyard where you either exchange money that you can use, kind of like at Disney, or I don't know if they do that anymore, but you exchange money so that you can use a special form of currency that is only used in the temple to buy a ritually pure animal. You either do that or you exchange an animal that you bring with you for a ritually pure animal. There are religious officiants that are experts in ritual slaughter that you will take that animal to. They will, in a highly choreographed way, slaughter that animal as you are there, and they will take part of that animal and make this burnt offering, will offer as a sacrifice. They will take part of that animal and retain it for themselves, since they don't get a salary, that this is what they eat. And then you will get part of it. And I can't emphasize enough the significance of that encounter. It's not just that the vast majority of the population at any point in the history of these temples, they hardly get meat ever. Meat is very expensive. It costs a lot to raise and maintain an animal. So not only are you getting meat, but you are in a very real way engaging in a ritual that allows you to dine with God. And the power of that, the symbolism, it's extraordinary if we think about how practitioners would have understood, practitioners who were undergoing that ritual would have understood the significance of it.
So it's opening this kind of gateway, so that it's really, as you're talking about before, imbuing the sacred, the secular act, a sacred feast.
Absolutely, and it allows, and let's not forget this idea of dining with someone. This has an extraordinary sociological significance. Who you choose to eat with, what you eat, where you eat, how you eat it. All of those are markers of identity. You want to make sure you're eating the right things with the right folks. So if you are quite literally dining with God, that ritual serves to reinforce and maintain this covenant relationship that really serves as a root metaphor for that vertical relationship that I mentioned earlier.
Interesting. So that horizontal and vertical coming together again. Interesting.
Absolutely. And you're right there at the matrix.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. So part of this series is focusing on, and we'll get to this question in just a minute, but focusing on brainstorming ways in which to use this information to build inclusivity, either in classrooms or in interactions with students or campus life in general. So in a few minutes, I'll want to kind of open it up to anyone who wants to share and think about that, but kind of plant that seed of in these next few minutes, think about how you might use information that was shared today to build greater inclusivity. This could even be, understanding your neighbors more or whatnot, of how are you going to use this information about diversity of Judaism, about these intersections of health and wellness and Jewish practice, or even things like what is kosher, those sorts of things. So as you're thinking about that and brainstorming, Dan, do you want to tackle this question of, have you seen the Netflix series Unorthodox? Kara wonders, she read an article on CNN that the show is accurate in portraying the beliefs and practices of Hasidic Jews. Have you seen it? What do you think?
I haven't seen it. I know that there is a kind of cottage industry of writing novels and making series and films about Orthodox women, especially, but I haven't seen that particular one. I thought we were going to talk about the. I thought we were going to talk about the question in the chat.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see the previous question. Yeah, the unorthodox question was in the chat as well. So the question is sacrificing a gendered act, and if so, why?
It absolutely is a gendered act, and that's because the whole ideology of sacrifice, all of the texts, all of this choreography that I mentioned earlier, all of that stems from a patriarchal androcentric culture. That is, it's patriarchal in the sense that it privileges the male head of the household as having both power and authority, and it's androcentric in the sense that it is male focused. So this would be men acting as pilgrims coming to the temple. This would be men functioning as these sacrificial officiants. It would even be male animals that would be sacrificed. So all of that is gendered. And we know part of that because, as I said, we know more about the second temple than we do about the first. Part of that is because in the second temple, we have evidence for a women's courtyard. So the second temple is constructed in what we call a cosmogonic fashion. That is, as you go further and further into the complex, you're supposed to be getting holier and holier until you get to a room that's called the Holy of Holies, that only the high priest can go into and only go in once a year. So as you're going in, there's a courtyard called the Gentile courtyard. So pagans can go up to that point, but no further. And then you've got a women's courtyard. So women can go up to that point, but no further. Partly because of that emphasis on a patriarchal androcentric context, but also partly because that patriarchal androcentric context has concerns about ritual purity. And women are notoriously ritually impure.
And in a different conversation, then we could talk about the bathing practices, the mikvah bath. And actually, this is good too to recognize on the handout that I just sent through the chat again for more resources about Judaism and Jewish communities in Southeast Nebraska. I've included a whole bunch of links on that handout. And in addition, there's information about looking into food that is significant during Passover, because Passover is coming up. And so if you want to do some more research to look further about significant food during Passover and symbolism, please look into that. Does anyone want to, at this point, this is really kind of meant to open this up a little bit, either more questions or any kind of sense of sharing at this point of how might you use some of this information to enhance inclusivity in the classroom and campus services, campus life with students, with your community, with neighbors, or more questions for Dan at this point. Feel free to make use of the chat, or if you're brave to share and to show your face, please do so. I think your discussion confirmed that being vegan is helpful when I host folks at my home, that's a good thing. Yeah, so we have one comment about it's interesting to talk to students in psych classes about religion and faith, that students are very open to those discussions. And I think Dan and I share similar kind of religious studies perspectives that, religion it comes from people wondering about the world and they're trying to make sense of themselves in the world. Can you talk a little bit about that in regards to kind of the psychological approach of understanding Jews and Jewish practice?
Absolutely. And I should say, and this is from Alina, Alina, I talk to my psych colleagues quite a bit. I teach a class on religion and violence, and there's quite a bit of social psychology that we do in that class. But let me again draw something in a terribly amateurish way for all of you that might help explain this. So, oh my goodness, I can't even look at this. Let's get rid of that. So as Jews are wondering, as I said, how do we be good Jews? How do we understand ourselves as Jews in this time? One of the ways that we can talk about that from a psychological perspective is the issue of cognitive dissonance. So I mentioned that the temple was destroyed in the Romans in around 70, right? So that obviously would have been a moment of extreme cognitive dissonance because, again, the temple is supposedly the only place that effective worship can happen. It's the only place where God is made manifest. And if that's gone, how do we be good Jews now? So that would be on this end. Well, through a process of what we call mutually mediated reading, Jews would engage their sacred texts and their traditions in an attempt to figure out, do we have stories? Do we have role models? Do we have paradigms? Are there resources in our intellectual or cultural traditions that can help us account for this cognitive dissonance, that can help us understand ourselves in a different way now? And spoiler alert, you always find something. And in the case of Judaism, they did find something. There's a wonderful story in a text called The Fathers According to Rabbi Nathan, where the great Jewish rabbi, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, is walking with a disciple of his by the temple as it's burning. And his disciple says, what are we supposed to do now? We can't make sacrifices anymore. And Yochanan tells him, yes, that's right, but we now have a method that is more effective than sacrifice. We have Gimelut Hasadim. We have acts of loving kindness. And so this is an example of accounting for that cognitive dissonance, of saying we are no longer capable of being Jews that perform only animal sacrifice now that the temple is destroyed. We have to reevaluate and re-understand our sacred texts and our heritage to allow us to move forward.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's a really kind of a nice way of kind of closing and thinking about the applicability of this is that, you know, with Judaism, this intersection of health, wellness, and spirituality is that being spiritual is always living in the world. It's very embodied. Mm-hmm. So it's all acts, including food consumption, but also health and wellness in regards to supporting your community, supporting your neighbors. That all is part of your relationship to God. And what I'm hearing is that something that I think we all can probably take away from this is realizing that religious traditions are not static. They're always moving, and allowing that, allowing students and neighbors and our community members to tell their story of who are they in that moment, and not to assume any sort of like static disposition. Is that kind of really what you're getting at, is this sense of being malleable with our understanding and almost welcoming that perspective?
Absolutely. Listen, even the most conservative Orthodox form of Judaism that you could imagine in our Nebraska context, even those folks have iPhones. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, there might be an interest in preserving and observing more strictly these mitzvot, these commandments, but you can never completely cut yourself off. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You're always moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so being mindful that we're getting close to the 1 o'clock hour, I would encourage everyone to continue to brainstorm and think about applying what we've learned here today in our various realms and our services to the college and our communities, being open and asking students questions, asking community members questions, making note that religious traditions are always very diverse, but just having that willingness to ask of, hey, I'm serving you. I want to bring food when we can all bring food again. I want to have food. Can you tell me a little bit, just are there dietary restrictions? And you can read more about Passover coming up. And so be knowledgeable about that. I know Dan is probably willing to stay on past the 1 o'clock hour. And so we'll continue to have open questions, but I did want to thank everyone for coming. And if you want to continue brainstorming anything, if you have questions for me about how to incorporate any sort of religion or faith components in classrooms or whatnot, please feel free to reach out to me. But any other questions? And in 2 weeks, we'll have our next session. But if there's any other questions, please feel free to stay on and ask. Otherwise, have a great Friday.
So let's see. Sarah, are you still around? There's Sarah. Sarah sent me a message in the chat.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, okay, good. Hi.
Hi.
I'm happy to answer this question. Is it okay to say it out loud?
Yeah.
Okay. So Sarah sent me a message in the chat asking, when you converted, did you convert from another religion? If so, how did the process go? I kind of did. I was raised as a United Methodist. My folks grew up in Southern Arkansas, and they were both raised Baptist. But when they moved to the city that I grew up in, they joined the United Methodist Church. So I grew up in that church, but it was never really a determinative religious identity for me. But I wasn't looking. Like I once we moved to Denver, I wasn't thinking, I'm going to go shopping and I'm going to find a new religion that works for me. It really just sort of fell into my lap. We needed a preschool for our son, and the best one in town was at Temple Sinai. And we just happened to show up on a day where somebody just happened to have just withdrawn one of their kids from the room that our son happened to need to go into. And once he got in there, we started volunteering in his classroom. And I got to know folks, and they found out that I was an academic, and they asked me to come teach a class or two. And I got to know more folks and feel comfortable with them. And they started inviting me to things like Passover dinners. And along the line, something just clicked. And if you're unfamiliar with the process of converting to Judaism, as I was, I mean, I knew intellectually what I had read in books, but I had also, like I said, grown up in a tradition where if you want to become a member, here's what you have to do, and you're in, right? To convert to Judaism was a year-long enterprise that included taking a class, that included some ritual practices, including doing the mikvah, doing the ritual bath at the end of it, and also going before a Beit Din, a rabbinic court, where they asked me lots and lots of questions. So it wasn't something that you could just do on a lark. It was something that you had to be really committed to.
Well, then I had a friend who converted to Orthodox, and she said she converted to Reform first and then had to reconvert to Orthodox.
Yes. Yep. Because there are different expectations and different levels of observance in these different trajectories of Judaism. So Reform to me made sense in terms of practice, but really also in terms of the kind of intellectual approach. That was something that was extremely attractive to me, was that here was a tradition where I felt like, and this was my own experience, I'm not making a blanket statement, but it felt like the United Methodist tradition that I grew up in wasn't as intellectually open as the tradition that I found in Judaism in Denver. I think I mentioned I grew up in Arkansas. So that original context might also have had something to do with it, because I also met United Methodists in Denver who were very intellectually open. Does that help, Sarah?
It did, thank you.
You're welcome. Let's see, religious conservatism is, yes, that's a great question. So again, it depends on the stream of Judaism that you're in. So I mentioned this rabbinic court that I had to appear before. One of the members of that was a female rabbi. So the community that I converted into, a Reform community, does allow women to be, not only to hold leadership positions, but to hold the leadership position. Now that's different in some streams of Judaism, and there's a lot of debate and a lot of, in some cases, there's some acrimony about that. But at least in the tradition that I identify with, women can be full participants. There is no, there's no machitza, there's no separating wall between men and women in worship, as there is in some conservative and Orthodox temples.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in Lincoln, the South Street Temple, the rabbi, she's now gone, but the most recent rabbi was female. But at Tifereth, Israel, which is conservative, they had a lay female leader, but she wasn't a rabbi. So in her community, in her tradition, she wasn't allowed to be a rabbi, but in the Reform tradition, someone could be.
Yep.
I can stay on for just a few more minutes if anybody else has any other questions for Dan. Otherwise, I'll need to log on to another Zoom session. But for those of you who stayed on, thank you so much for coming. If there's any other questions, or if you have any other questions, you can email them to me or send them to Dan directly. not, thanks so much, Dan, for coming. And thank
Oh,
you all
no.
for coming.